Morning, everybody. It's nice to be with you on this beautiful morning, but I think we've already had a wake-up call about what can happen on beautiful mornings. So I'm just going to give a general introduction to the day from my perspective. I've called my talk Process Safety, not so much a program, more a way of life. And why have I called it that? Well, first of all, to emphasize that safety, process safety, of course, is not just a program of activities. It's absolutely fundamental to everything we do. And unless it actually permeates the whole of an organization from top to bottom and is integral to everything we do from initial design to full implementation, then it's likely to be ineffective. And so if I take the quality of life matrix that the iChemE has in terms of summarizing everything that chemical engineering does, we've got 4 key challenges there, of which energy is a major one. So these are things that affect the quality of our life, and I don't need to remind you how energy, particularly oil and gas, is fundamental to the quality of life we have here and across the world. And then there's some cross-pinning issues like the fundamentals of engineering, but absolutely key to underpinning all those things that determine the quality of our life is process safety. And as you've heard, I've had a mixed industrial academic career, and one thing that we absolutely teach our students at Imperial College and all chemical engineering departments in day one is that process safety is not an add-on, it's endemic in everything that you do. And so let's get that straight away, that look at everything that you do in your course while you're learning, and then in your career when you're implementing. Think safety and think process safety. I also called it not so much a program, more a way of life. I'm not sure how many in this room remember this, but in the 1960s there were some, when people came out of the woodwork and started to challenge the establishment, and particularly holding leaders to account, there was a program called That Was the Week That Was, and that was followed by not so much a program, more a way of life. And this challenged leaders about decisions that were taken and exposed the weakness sometimes of leadership, amongst other things, in society at that time. And so I'll come back to that later, but in the 1960s we had our share of offshore accidents. We had the Torrey Canyon in 1967, 800,000 barrels oil spill off Cornwall, and then in Santa Barbara there was a Union platform blowout, which 80,000 barrels spill, but that really was a sea change as far as the US were concerned in putting much tighter environmental legislation in place, but not the same sort of safety case that we later adopted here. We'll come back to that. So what are we talking about in terms of the things that underpin process safety that if we need to follow to get it right? Well, the first thing I'm going to emphasize is learning, avoiding repeated mistakes, because any accident, of course, is only when several things come together, and in our case it's loss of containment and barriers to the subsea being broken down and absent, so that effectively an accident occurs because there's a release, because the barriers have not been effective. But also it's seeing the broader picture, that when you look at any accident, it's the root causes that are the main lessons there, not necessarily the specifics about any accident. And I'll come back in a minute to ask how good are we? We've just tried to see how much do we know. I'd ask how well do we learn? Then there's the legislation, and of course in this country for a long time now, we've had a safety case regime where the responsibility for managing risk is with the creator of that risk, and the responsibility is to make sure that all those risks are identified and managed properly. So risk ownership and management is absolutely fundamental to our safety case regime. And working in the industry, you'll, I'm sure, appreciate the benefits of a safety case rather than a more prescriptive safety case regime in managing major hazards, which is the core of what we're going to talk about today. But fundamental to all, the third L of this is leadership, because none of this will happen unless an organisation has a culture where this is endemic in the organisation. And so, as we heard in the introduction of the MAH Understanding Group, everybody at every level in the industry is responsible for ensuring that we have good process safety and minimal or no accidents. But it's especially important in the top leaders in a company at board level and the senior managers, because unless there's leadership by example there, that this is really absolutely prime to the way that companies operate, then again, ensuring that this is imbued throughout the organisation becomes increasingly difficult. It can't be a scattered approach where some people appreciate it and others don't, because, of course, any accident happens where there's the weakest link, and it only takes one weak link for an accident to happen. So, I asked the question, let's take the 3 L's, how well do we learn? This is an article in 2013 in the Chemical Engineer, the institution's house journal, about an explosion in Texas, in a place called West in Texas. This was actually an ammonium nitrate plant. Go back to 1921 in Uppau in Germany. There was an ammonium nitrate plant exploded. Of course, fertilizers, highly dangerous if not treated in the right way in their production as well as their use. And there, 430 dead, 2,000 injuries, 700 homes destroyed in the 1920s. Do we learn? No. Go to Texas City in the US, 20 years later, 1947, 600 dead, 5,000 injuries. Do we learn? Yet again, 2001, Toulouse in France, 30 dead, 2,000 injuries, 500 homes damaged. And then the one the article was about, another decade later, 2013 in Western Texas, 14 dead, 200 injuries. So, sorry, I'm operating 2 things at once here. So, those were the 3 that I've just talked about, and that's the latest one. So, catastrophic accidents, major deaths and injuries. So, why am I talking to you in the offshore oil and gas business about an ammonium nitrate accident? I use it because it presents a sequence of how we don't learn, that the root causes of those accidents were all similar. But also the fact that the root causes of accidents cross boundaries. And so we've all something to learn from major accident hazards in whatever sector they are. And of course, there are similar stories to the ones I've just told for many chemical processes and other process sectors. So in refining, in offshore, your main focus, oil and gas storage and so on. Because the lessons learned are not process specific. And unless we get to those root causes, then and just concentrate on the, if you like, the specific incidents and the things that went wrong in particular cases without looking at the root causes of those, then again, designing those into future practice will be flawed. And so the lessons are all about the engineering. They're all about the culture. They're all about the management and the leadership in organisations to take these lessons on board and bring best practice to the forefront and to learn from past incidents. And I'm not talking about now about just learning from accidents, because of course before those accidents there are lots of precursor incidents. There are near misses, and then there are precursor operational incidents that could have led to major accidents but didn't. There, but for the grace of God, go I many times, on many processes, on many days. And so it's getting into the culture to learn from everything that impacts process safety, not just the things when there's a major accident. Unfortunately, in terms of learning major accidents and changing things generically in the industry and in legislation and everything, sometimes we only respond when there's a major accident. So let's move on from fertilizers to the oil and gas industry, and there are many publications in this area. One that I'm particularly familiar with is Marcias' 100 Largest Losses, published every 2 years, and that was published the 2016 edition last month, and I wrote the foreword to that, where in that foreword I stressed this issue about the need to learn from these past incidents. This catalogue is very useful, but it's only useful going forward if we learn from the underpinning incidents. Now, if you look at the property damage in those 100 largest losses by sector, you'll see there that the upstream is about a third, refining about a stream, petrochemicals about a third. But the thing I'd stress about the upstream, if you take the 20 highest losses in major accidents over this period, going back to the 1970s, 50% of them are in the upstream. So in terms of the insured loss, it looks about a third. But in terms of the actual severity of those incidents, then 50% are in the upstream. And these are only the insured losses. Of course, there's the other things about loss of business. There's the costs of compensation, litigation, and there's the risk, which probably should underpin everything, even though the major problem and the major concern we should have, of course, is the loss of life and injury. But if we look at it in financial terms, then reputational risk and what this does to not only individual companies, but the industry as a whole, I don't need to tell you how the major accidents we've had over the last few decades have a widespread effect with the public, with government and confidence generally. So if we go through a few of these, I'm not going to bore you with going too long through the catalogue, but wasn't only fertilizers that Texas City had a problem with. Of course, in March 2005, there was the Texas City Refinery accident, resulting in 15 killed and over 100 injured with major losses. And of course, in our offshore sector, the sea change in 1988 of the Piper Alpha platform, where a permit to work system failure resulted in 167 being killed. That, of course, is a landmark incident in that not only was it really major, it's the worst accident we've had, but it resulted in a complete change in the way that we manage and legislate for health and safety, and the safety case regime introduced there, and the increase or the way that we manage health and safety in this country through the Health and Safety Executive as it became. I just wanted to highlight that things go on. So there were two major accidents that new to the list in 2016 in the offshore compared with the previous list, and there was this major fire on a complex of 6 platforms in the Mexican Bay of Campeche, where 3 were killed and 8 injured. And the root cause of the initial failure was corrosion of a small bore pipeline. Another rig fire like Piper Alpha. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Were the lessons learnt? Unfortunately, not. There's some accidents we can't control, of course. this was the unpronounceable Icelandic earthquake and volcanic eruption in 2010. And I happened to be in the States, and I just managed to get out once they opened the airspace when I heard about this fire in the Gulf of Mexico, that there seemed to be an incident there that I picked up at the airport. When I got back to the UK, of course, this turned out to be the Macondo Blowout, and this major accident again having seismic consequences for the oil and gas industry, particularly offshore and deep water. And I didn't know it at the time, but this was to actually take over my life for more than 90 days and beyond. If we look at the details of that, the wellhead blowout, 11 deaths, 17 injured, and the oil discharge going over almost 90 days, 5 million barrels, over 200 million gallons, or 300 Olympic swimming pools of oil into the Gulf of Mexico. And the estimated loss was 610 million there, according to Marsh, in terms of insured losses. But of course, the cost to BP has been of order 50 billion, and the reputational cost enormous. Well, I initially was in the hot seat for those 90 days, being called upon to explain on radio and television and in the papers what was happening and why it was caused in the first place, and what was being done to try and solve a problem where what you've essentially got is an exposed top of a hose pipe on the seabed with no means of actually plugging it, because the worst case scenario, and how you actually had tools that you could deploy on the seabed at those depths, had either not been thought through or actually put into the risk case. And so I survived interview by John Humphreys, and I even did an interview with South African radio behind the pavilion at Lord's. Such was the interest in what was going on there. But of course, the issue then, even though this was in the States, was could it happen here, the North Sea, and was our own regulatory regime robust enough to have prevented it happening? And so I thought that was it. I'd used my engineering expertise and experience in the oil and gas industry, but I was now back in academia, so I could put my head above the parapet. I was then asked by DEC and HSE to chair the independent inquiry into our own regulatory regime in the light of the findings from various Macondo inquiries. And so that took place in 2010, 2011, and as was said in the introduction, there was the report from that. Our findings basically were that our safety case regime is robust, but in any system there's always room for improvement, and a safety case regime requires the owners of the risk, that is you, the people that run the industry, to take a large part in actually making the system more robust. And a lot of the recommendations were about what the industry could do, and I'm pleased to say the response has been amazing to that, in terms of particularly what Oil and Gas UK and Step Change have done to actually bring you all together. So let's just take this and see what stops us learning, what lessons did we learn from this. And I'm not going to go through a detailed blow-by-blow account of the lessons from Macondo. Most of you will, I think, be familiar with those, but let's just take this as a case study in how well we learn. Not long before this, the Montara platform in Northern Territory in Australia had a cement failure, hydrocarbon influx, the BOPs didn't work, there was a blowout, a fire, an oil spill, and that all again sounds familiar. So the message I want to convey is that whenever we have an accident, doesn't it sound familiar? So we don't learn from it. There's also, it can't happen here. In the North Sea, there were a couple of incidents there, Bardolino and Bittern, where there was a loss of containment, problem with the integrity of the well, but the BOPs worked. And so that could have been similar to what happened in the Gulf of Mexico, but the final barriers there did work. Then there's the attitude that our process couldn't happen here because our process is different, or our process is better. And again, it's going back to root causes, and the analysis of the root causes, not the superficiality of how different the process is. So focusing on the detail of failure mechanisms rather than on the system root causes can often miss things in terms of lessons learned and what we do. So the major thing that stops us learning then is complacency, that everything is okay. We don't need to go back and continually do this, so that it's not so much a program, more a way of life. You'll be pleased to know that I'm not going to now give you a catalogue of what the recommendations were. I just want to pick out a few things, 4 things in fact, where I think leadership, senior management leadership, is absolutely key. And the first thing was improving the learning culture and processes for spreading best practice. And one thing, just to go back to the Macondo incidents, that concerned us very much was that on the day of the Macondo accident, there was a senior management visit to the Macondo rig, and that had a focus on safety. But what it did was it focused on operational and personal safety, trip hazards and things like that, and handrails or whatever. In the control room, major indicators were being alerted that there was a problem. But from the evidence, the senior management team that day did not take an interest in what was happening there or intervene to actually raise concerns. It was probably too late anyway, but because this was all to do with the way that these various barriers had been managed in the past. But I think there's a wake-up call there that even when senior management thinks it's taking an interest and has its finger on the pulse, it doesn't necessarily have it in the right places. Another thing was strengthening mechanisms to assure implementation of safety and environmental management systems. So the safety case requires you to identify risks and put in place an operational procedure for managing those risks. But then you need another layer in your safety management systems that actually have measures and indicators that show that you're doing what you said you'd do. And sometimes these human factors in terms of, we know that this needed to be done, but if the system hasn't been embedded with a combination of automatic software systems linked to human surveillance and monitoring, then assuring the implementation of the safety case is not guaranteed. And this, of course, these are all linked. So there's an increased focus on competency and training of the workforce. And this is linked to learning from past incidents as well. And so this is where Oil and Gas UK, Step Change, and the companies operating in the UK North Sea, I think in the last 3 or 4 years have come together with a step change in beginning to share information. It's not only the willingness to share information and overcoming those barriers about reputation and potential liabilities and things like that. It's also speed of response, because from the examples I gave of Macondo, some of those incidents were quite close to when Macondo happened. And if it takes years for these things to get spread round, then nobody's in a position to actually learn from those experiences. And so improved training and making sure that this goes right through the work chain. So the training of subcontractors and operators, understanding that the competency of everyone in the subcontractor chain is their responsibility ultimately, is another thing that we emphasise, and I think we're seeing some improvements on. And of course, enhanced workforce engagement, making sure that everybody in the operational chain, where they see something of concern, can feed that back in, encouraging the whistleblowing culture so that anyone is not afraid to actually speak up when needed, and making sure that the more formal engagement of the workforce in safety practices on rigs and in preparing safety cases and everything is improved. And I'm pleased to say that virtually all the recommendations were accepted, both by the government and by the industry, and that we've seen some significant enhancements there. But we mustn't be complacent, and so the message I'll leave you with there is that where you've been engaged in that, thank you, and where you, but let's take our foot off the pedal, because there are new things that, as we've heard this morning with the unfortunate and the disastrous helicopter accident, in some way it's good news that past failures have not proved a problem, but then there's a concern there must be something new that hasn't been seen before. And so this whole aspect of risk ownership is fundamental, and that has to be throughout the organisation. And so we do it not because the rules say I have to, but because everyone in the chain understands that workers should not be put to risk of harm, and that everyone has responsibility for their safety. So it's because it's the natural thing to do, to manage those risks. And again, I stress that the leadership, those of you in this room, your colleagues in your companies, it's absolutely fundamental to take this on board and drive that home, and I'm sure you do. So we had an app trying to see where things were in organisations. So you can ask yourself those sorts of questions. Where is safety in your organisation? Is it top of the agenda? Is it the number one priority that drives everything? Or is it simply delegated to specialists and they'll look after it? And it needs specialists, of course. Specialists to, but it needs those specialists to advise at the highest levels what is right and what needs doing, so that there's board responsibility for things and it's a core value of a company. And part of this is how you measure performance. That is it that no news is good news? We don't need to worry. Is it lagging indicators like the days since the last time accident? These are things that are outputs that say how things are going, but they're nothing to do with what you're doing to actually prevent accidents. Do contractors count as much as your own employees? Are your indicators lagging ones like the statistics on accidents, or are they leading in terms of what you're doing in terms of training, what you're doing in terms of learning from past incidents and things like that, that are in the prevention category? And what you're doing to compare your performance and benchmarking against the best practice in the industry, and wholeheartedly involved in sharing knowledge and learning. And I want to close by just referring to something else in the context of today's workshop, which is in the managing these things in an environment of low prices. Of course, we've seen this dramatic drop in oil prices, and also a lower than projected demand, which has led to the major fall in price. There's been major reductions in employment. And so herein lies concerns that there's a potential here in this sort of environment for cost cutting that safety suffers as a result of that. There are potential reductions in risk control measures, in maintenance, inspection and safety training, and that there's some compromise of asset activity and loss prevention measures in the light of that. And as we lose people, then of course we lose expertise. And much as software and automatic systems, both instrumentation, software and devices are important, of course these are no use without the expertise that's gone in both to create them and manage them. And that loss of safety expertise and corporate memory is something that we should all, I think, keep an eye on. So this is where leadership action is absolutely primary, that you know, a culture of cost saving should not compromise risk management. So you can make savings as long as you keep your eye on the ball, that we haven't compromised the management of that risk. There are different ways to manage risks, make sure that they're all robust, and that the KPIs that are used measure that maintenance of of risk management and are closely monitored, and that we continue to learn from past experience. And in the Marsh report, you'll see there's some statistics. This doesn't necessarily mean that it's causal, but if you look at previous low price points in the spectrum of oil and gas prices, then some of the largest losses have occurred in the year or two after dips to local minima in the oil and gas price. And so, as I say, this doesn't necessarily say that one has caused the other, but it does indicate there's a higher risk of not managing the risks in this sort of environment. So let me end. Here are the key elements of process safety, most of which I've alluded to in my presentation, and all of them have got a leadership element, and include number 2 there. Really strong leadership is needed. But I've put one in red there, and that is there's nothing better than a sense of vulnerability. Once we actually feel comfortable, then risk go up and risk management is likely to suffer. And if we go back to that quote at the beginning, Andrew Hopkins, I think it was, of saying that a conscientious head of an organisation does not sleep at night, amongst other things, because they're concerned about the next accident. They haven't left it to everyone else in the organisation. They're continually thinking about that and have a feeling of vulnerability that we want to make sure that we haven't missed something or that things are likely to creep up on us. And I just put this one slide up about what IChemE does in terms of training to embed process safety skills. One concern we have is that we have noticed that the amount of training that's being done in the safety area has decreased significantly over the last year, 18 months, with the lower oil and gas price, not only in the oil and gas sector, but across the process sector generally. And that's a concern, an alarm that we would like to raise, that as long as training is being done in other ways, that's fine. But our indicator is that it's being decreased. And just to highlight another way that leaders can actually make sure that they have the best professional process safety engineers in the process, that we now accredit professional process safety engineers. So you can become a chartered engineer as a process safety engineer right across engineering disciplines, which is another way of actually accrediting and benchmarking the people in your organisation that bring that expertise that you need, and make sure that it's benchmarked against the best in across the process industries. And we do that through our IChemE Process Centre, which operates globally, and I'm sure a lot of you are aware of that. More information on our website. So, back to the 1960s, and not so much a programme, more a way of life. Here we had people challenging leaders and holding leaders to account. I think in process safety, it's the responsibility of company leaders to challenge the status quo. It's your role to actually be continually challenging that status quo and stimulate a culture of continuous improvement, and challenge your team to continuously demonstrate that all process risks are being identified and managed. Don't take their word for it. Ask them to demonstrate so that you've got appropriate measures in place, that you're comfortable that everything is being done to manage that risk. So although it's everybody's responsibility to look after process safety, everybody in the chain, safety engineering needs you, and it's up to all of us, but especially you, to make sure that the world knows that process safety matters. Thank you.